Welcome back, friends, to another episode of Liminal Phrames. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Darren King, also known as ExoAcademian. Darren, it is quite cold outside, but in the news, things are really heating up. I didn't write that, but I felt like saying it. It's good to be back in the podcast chair with you. I always look forward to these conversations. I know the show is going to be a good one when the list that we have before the show is longer than my arm. It's a lot of things to cover here, and I'm really looking forward to getting into them with you. And I know that when this comes out, there will probably be more announcements or news that have broken and hit the airwaves that we haven't had a chance to even discuss. So that tells me that things are quite active, and there's a lot of momentum and movement happening in the conversation at large. Before we jump into the topics, though, I always want to catch up with you and see how you're doing. I really enjoyed listening to your recent Point of Convergence episode. I think I got a lot of good feedback on that. It reminded me of conversations you and I have had about the simulation hypothesis and kind of how our views have grown and changed over the years as we've discussed that and explored those concepts together. But it was really, really good to listen to that, and I think a valuable addition to the conversation. So other than that, I know you're super busy with all the things on your plate, and what else is going on? Love that cabin shot that you shared, by the way, as well. That was really beautiful.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it was actually the first time we've had a good snow since I moved here. I moved here 2 years ago. And when I was out walking in the snow, I ran into a couple who moved here in 2021, and they said this is actually the first real snow they remember as well. And there's still snow on the ground now, even a week later, because it's been pretty cold, like you say. But for me, as you say, to use your analogy, yes, things have been heating up for sure. Red hot, you might say. I'm excited about where we are. Of course, it feels almost circus-like, the kind of situation we have right now. The environment feels just supercharged with excitement, some confusion, some trepidation. All is in the mix, and we'll get into some of that today because there's plenty to talk about. There was numerous bullet points, and we'll see if we get to them all because it really is pretty interesting just how much is going on. And for me personally, I'm excited because this upcoming week, I'm going to announce 2 new classes for my Essence of Being initiative. So one is the Expanding Awareness class. So if people have not had a chance to take that yet, I'd encourage that. And a new class called Frontiers of Experience, which is going to take the different contact modalities and kind of a survey kind of course, go through each of them in different weeks. You can find information on my website, essenceofbeing.info. And as I said, I'll be announcing those classes this week, and registration will open up this week as well.
Awesome. Well, let's jump right in. Where do we want to start? Again, I'm looking at this list. Sorry, everybody. You can't see what I'm looking at. It's very long, but I'm very excited about it. So why don't you kick us off? Where do you want to begin?
Right. So if you sort of pick a theme for what's happened in January, which was kind of hinted at the end of last year, it's all about whistleblowers. We have whistleblowers aplenty, including firsthand witnesses. But the first one that sort of arose more recently was Jesse Michaels actually had a video he put together where he was interviewing Randy Anderson, who's a Green Beret who saw something really interesting. So I'm just going to describe the situation here and then get your take, and I'll riff on this as well in terms of what we thought about the person, what we thought about the credibility, and what we thought about in terms of the implications of what he described seeing. So Randy Anderson is a Green Beret and an American hero. In March of 2014, he was taken to an underground facility at Naval Surface Warfare Center Crane in Indiana to a secure, secret, compartmentalized facility titled, quote-unquote, off-world technology. He was shown an orb levitating above a podium and a gauntlet emitting holographic, hieroglyphic-looking text. This second object reportedly killed the person retrieving it. I have back-channeled with Navy contacts. This is Jesse speaking here. I have back-channeled with Navy contacts who say that while Wright-Patterson reverse engineers the Air Force's most exotic retrieve technology, Crane does this for the Navy, unquote. So that was something that Jesse Michaels wrote in terms of describing Randy Anderson and his background and what he encountered. So he broke this in a video interview with Randy Anderson. I know we've both seen that. Would like to get your take on Randy himself and what he saw.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the interview. The thing that struck me immediately was Randy's body language. And this was a person that, just what I could tell, didn't really want to necessarily be on camera, want to be seen. And Jesse made a point of talking about this as well. He kind of didn't want to hype up his own background, and the Green Beret sort of culture is very much subdued and modest in terms of talking about their accomplishments and that kind of thing. And that came through in just the way that he was on screen in that video. Had a hat on and really wouldn't look at the camera. It just seemed like he was kind of very protective of his personal space, which I can appreciate. As far as the encounter, a lot of fascinating things there that were parallel to things that we've already been exposed to. So the metallic orb, metallic sphere the size of a basketball, I mean, that has a lot of corollaries in both imagery that we have seen over the years and in things that people have spotted in the sky. The Mosul orb is another example of that. The orb that Ross Coulthart, there was that whole special a couple years ago where he had the orb, and there are lots of sort of jokes about the orb because it was like in a rocking chair at one point or something. So this orb, this metallic sphere, is a part of the lore, and the fact that there's just one sitting in a laboratory, that had a lot of resonance. At least, it's very interesting. The plaque on the outside of that room, off-world technology, that got a lot of interesting, kind of flack, I guess, in the social circles as well. People saying, like, would they really just label it off-world technology? That seems a little bit too on the nose, kind of silly even. But I also think about, what Gary McKinnon referenced when he was, getting those files from the NASA hack that he did. I think one of those files or something was like the list of off-world officers or something, or it was similar language to that. And so this phrase off-world has certainly been used or has been bandied around in the community for many, many years. So maybe sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. It wouldn't necessarily surprise me that there is, in fact, a room just labeled off-world technology. I mean, it seems a little silly, but I could see it happening. The gauntlet object or bracelet or whatever it was with the hieroglyphics, also fascinating because the hieroglyphics have been discussed recently as well and have corollaries to fairly recent experiences, high profile experiences. Deep Prasad mentioned that it was reminding him of what he saw. There's the recent DMT episode where they were looking at the laser light and they were seeing the code in the Matrix, quote unquote. We did a show about that a little bit. And so interesting corollaries there. Even our good friend, David Lanier, mentioned in one of his social posts that when he was on board a craft that he saw writings that were similar to that. And then, of course, Danny Sheehan, the writings that he put down a legal pad when he was given access to these archives. He's kind of smuggled this writing out of the archive review. He wrote it inside a legal pad. It was it was etchings that he saw around the rim of a crashed saucer-shaped craft. So how do you evaluate this? I think this is the big question for me. One, it takes a lot of guts, in my opinion, for somebody to come out and put themselves on the platform that Jesse Michaels has. It's a lot of eyeballs. And for somebody that comes from a culture where you're not really wanting to be out in the front, that must be incredibly awkward and strange. Why now? He seems to say that he felt emboldened to share this, that he felt like, people should know that this is just an experience that he had. But he also made several points that he wasn't necessarily landing exactly on what he thought it was. He said he was open to other, interpretations about what it could be. So I thought that was, fair-minded. And then he also gave us some experience that he had at Area 51, at Groom Lake, and, seeing other technologies that U.S. has. He alluded to the fact that he's personally aware. This is where sort of like his statements got more confident. He's personally aware that the U.S. has more advanced technologies than the public is aware of. I thought that was a good statement to hear. It doesn't necessarily mean we've reverse engineered them or whatnot. It just means there is, in fact, a lot of technology that we've developed that is further along than the public might think. And I think that's really, really revealing. Jesse went to his defense after the publishing of that video because, of course, the guy got attacked. I mean, that's one thing that I get a little bit frustrated about, and I understand why. But when every time a whistleblower comes forward, somebody goes into their closet and says, "Well, look at all this stuff about them, and therefore they can't be trustworthy." Well, I appreciate that kind of research to a certain degree, but I also get frustrated because there is no perfect witness. And so you're always going to find something in someone's background that says, well, you can't really trust them. They had PTSD, or they have it in their portfolio, has money invested in SAIC or whatever it is, Lockheed Martin, whatever it is. So it's easy to pick apart someone if you're looking for any flaw that they have, because we all have them. So in short, I found it interesting, found it compelling. Another data point, it matches up with other data points that we've got in our lore. And it does seem to be adding to this kind of momentum, this cresting wave of whistleblowers that are coming out and coming forward.
Yeah, agreed on most of those points. In fact, all those points. I think that it's been interesting to see not just what he presented, but also people's reaction to it, like you said. And of course, we should remember that some of the groups that do not want this out are also going to try to character assassinate him or question his credibility, leak certain things to journalists and that kind of thing. We've seen that happen before, of course, with David Grush. So we know this is part of the tactics that the gatekeepers will use to try to obfuscate and keep this from really resonating with people. Several things come to mind here. Yeah, you mentioned the tests and the fact that he has gone through tests. So he talks about at one point being taken through these different tests, and these different Green Berets would be put through these series of tests. And those who pass the test were kind of put into a smaller subgroup, and you keep going along. If you keep passing the test, you get put in more and more of kind of an elite group that involves not just physical acumen, but also psychological capabilities as well. And then finally, it led to him being shown these things in this skiff that was, like you say, labeled off-world technology. So he leaves open the possibility, as you hinted at, that maybe that was just another level of a test. They were actually just going to show him stuff that looked like it could be ET in origin or off-world tech, just to see how he would react, to see if he would lose it, maybe as a test to see if maybe they should now have shown him the real thing or invite him into some sort of super secret program. We've heard that from other people. We think back to the footage of the alien autopsy, and there were different figures who said the same thing. At first, they thought it was real. Then they thought it was actually a test to see how he'd respond, to see if he would leak information, and only then would they invite him into something deeper. So you have all these psychological tests that are being constantly conducted. You have kind of subterfuge that's part of the process as well. Now, to your point about him saying that he's aware that we have some really advanced tech that's far beyond what we see in the mainstream kind of thing. That was interesting. But of course, what occurs to me in terms of an implication of that is that for the skeptics and debunkers, they can go to town with this and say, aha, see, he's basically saying all these things we're seeing in the sky are actually attributable to just being super top secret black tech. I don't think that's what he's saying, but again, people can go to town on that, and it does get tricky to know where does that line divide. And of course, like you pointed out, if some of it is reverse engineered, then some of it might look quite similar to the ET tech or the NHI tech. So this kind of makes the situation more clouded, difficult to parse out, but that's what we're called to do. And by the way, something I just wrote on social media before we started recording was that while now it seems like there's light at the end of the tunnel and we're about to break through into the mainstream with all of this movement, we should expect that actually the obfuscation will ramp up from here. We'll have disinformation campaigns going into overdrive so that these counter narratives kind of cancel each other out. We should expect that this is the case. Don't be surprised when there's suddenly 6 or 7 or 8 or 25 different narratives trying to describe what's going on here. Now, in terms of this symbolic code-like stuff he saw, yes, that's fascinating because that's come up over time. As you say, it's been seen sometimes on the surface of craft, although even then, sometimes it looks like it might be just off the craft a little bit, like holographic-like. Like you pointed to, we have the DMT experiments where people on DMT, which seems to modulate our consciousness, can see what looks like code within this red laser light. And I will say that in that experience I had on Christmas Day, I went to a realm where I was seeing code-like structure like that as well. And I remember noticing it and wondering what it was. And then coming back into this construct, partly it was a direct revelation, but partly also putting 2 and 2 together after having seen that code-like structure. Could that be the source code that gives rise to our reality? The same question that that same DMT researcher was asking about this code. Hard to know, but it's fascinating how much this comes up over and over again. Of course, we have ancient monolithic structures that also have some of these same kind of symbols. So it raises questions around not only how long have these things been around, have they been using really advanced technology going back into ancient Egypt and things like that, but there's also the question around if this is code-like and therefore perhaps rendering this reality, are these beings coming from outside the construct, which might help us understand why they seem so powerful and sometimes almost omniscient? Because, of course, outside the construct, you don't have the barriers of space and time. Things don't roll out that way. Those are not the parameters of the video game, if you will, or the virtual reality. They're going to appear to us like celestial beings, highly powerful, and we're going to see them as gods, perhaps, or perhaps in a more modern kind of way of thinking, as ETs, highly advanced ETs. So this just ramps up the interest here because, as you and I have explored on this podcast, and I've explored on POC many, many times, the question comes back to the nature of reality. What is this? Where are we? What kind of context are we within? And how do these others relate to that context? Really, really fascinating. So that's some of the things to say about Randy Anderson. I would just say in terms of credibility, I found him credible. Like you said, I think it's unfortunate that people right away want to kind of tear him down. I'm thankful for Jesse for making this person's story known. I agree with you that he seems like a humble individual. He didn't like being on camera. I agree with that as well. Clearly, the fact that he chose the Green Berets over something like the Navy SEALs says something about the cultural difference and his preference for that. And it's just one additional piece that we can bring to bear here to try to make sense of what's going on. All right, so that's the first of the whistleblowers, but that's just the beginning of a parade here. So now let's move on to what Jeremy Corbell has been saying recently. So he said that whistleblowers are coming. Not sure if he means the same ones as Ross Coulthart and Jesse Michaels mean or a different one, but he said it's guaranteed to be, quote unquote, a game changer. And again, of course, some of this was foreshadowed at the end of last year as well. Now, we know Jeremy can be pretty dramatic, but he seems to genuinely believe what he's saying. Of course, we also have Lou Elizondo saying on camera to Jeremy that there's a credible threat against Jeremy's life, and he should be careful, not do anything too extreme. And we know that Lou also had a threat against his life a few months ago that prevented him from traveling and actually meeting up with a group that I was with in Houston at the time. Let me turn it over to you for some of your initial reactions to Jeremy. There's more with Jeremy's thing we're going to get to in a second, but initially thinking about this notion of threats against people's lives, these different people that have been put in the foreground as the messengers, people like Lou Elizondo, people like Jeremy Corbell. What do you make sense of that, and what has come out from him recently?
Evaluating Jeremy's contributions requires a nuanced perspective. Jeremy has absolutely done good work for this cause, and also I think his work can sometimes get in the way of what he is trying to accomplish. If you think about what types of media our culture consumes and is attracted to, Jeremy is the kind of guy that I think embodies that attention, embodies that, sort of eyeball. He's the kind of person that would come forward with this information and be the one that's on these types of shows, and he'd be saying the kinds of things that he's saying because it's the type of media product that we have, sort of demanded as a culture as something worthy of our attention. And so when we see it, we can't help but want to look at it. But at the same time, there's a part of us that goes, this feels a little bit contrived, manufactured, a little bit like a carnival barker, like somebody who's trying to sell you something. And I think both things are true in some way or another, but there's also there's kernels of truth within what he's saying as well. If we just have to kind of suspend our judgment on it a little bit, which is difficult because I think we want to be able to say, you know what, this is the last straw, and there's another Jeremy thing that he's doing, and it's way over the top, and it's so dramatic, and I can't trust it anymore, and it's absolutely ridiculous, and therefore anything that Jeremy says can't be trustworthy or listened to whatsoever. Making these blanket kinds of statements, which I see made quite often, I think that's the wrong position to take. I think we need to take it in, absorb it, evaluate it, not necessarily land in terms of saying like, this is going to be true, this is not going to be true. And we have to recognize that we're taking the good with the bad, right? This is just part of the way that this process is going to work when it begins to unfold in the public space, because this is the public forum we have created, right? This is the culture we have created where when news breaks, like this is what news breaking looks like in the culture that we have crafted for it. And if you don't like what you're seeing now, I have bad news for you. It's probably going to get worse, because that's just how this is. That's how this kind of thing operates. And as a result, we're going to have to try to parse the sensationalized claims from the truth. And I think there is that truth that is there. And sometimes we may not know what that truth happens to be until we have the benefit of hindsight looking back. So I'm not a person that says we should never hear from Jeremy or we should never listen to Jeremy. I think we should, appreciate what he's doing, the contribution that he's making. He does seem to be earnest in what he's saying. But I also am a person who's going to not necessarily take everything that he says at face value and try to weigh that against all the other facts and data points that I happen to have in the ongoing conversation that is taking place.
Yeah, agreed. And it's important here when people think about the message that they also think about the messenger. Sometimes the medium is the message. If not that, in total, it's at least part of the message. So we have to remember that when we hear information, when we are accommodating information that's coming in, we're going to screen it through some sort of filter system. And sometimes people have done work to be conscious of that filter system, and sometimes they haven't. And there can be people who are well-meaning and being intellectually honest who might not be aware of ways that they're straining out certain parts of information, or how they might not be aware of how some ways that the information is delivered to them might be suspicious. Really depends. So you think about when you're in an airport and you get asked numerous times. Remember when I was flying out of Copenhagen, I was asked 4 or 5 times, did you receive a package from anyone before getting on the plane? And of course, they're concerned about someone giving you a bomb or something, and they're asking you to be vigilant. Are you aware of where you're getting the information from? That kind of thing. Now, speaking of threats, and there being a threat to Jeremy's life, there was before a threat to Lou's life, apparently. We've also heard of intimidation tactics against David Grush and his family. Well, Jeremy also spoke about a threat to all of humankind that is arising. And this was part of a new series that he's been involved in. And as you and I talked about before we started recording, there have never been more different numbers of UFO documentaries and series as they are now. It's really flooding the airwaves. Of course, this is partly because we have many different streaming services and everybody wants to get in on the party. But this is very much the hot topic these days. And so ufological documentaries are everywhere. And of course, part of the challenge with that is that they kind of need to one-up each other sometimes. So some are more intellectually honest than others. Some kind of play into our cultural clickbait kind of mentality and are trying to be sensational. But Jeremy talked about something that we've discussed before that ufology has been discussing for a while, and this is this timeline around 2027. So he introduced a bit of a curveball into the mix here, because he said that even when we're talking about the government acknowledging that UFOs are real, he was suggesting that they're telling you a truth to set you up to believe a lie. That's almost a direct quote of what he was saying. So he's saying we should champion, celebrate the fact that now the government has said UFOs are real. But what he also added was that they are letting you know that, but only so they can then deliver a second message, which he thinks is part of a control structure campaign, basically. So we think about this notion of 2027 was going to be a big year. This is something that Jeremy said in this documentary. I'm going to quote him now. He said, quote, "It's nuanced how they explain that, the nature of that threat." There's that word. "But that 100 bleeping % is the lie you are going to be told. You even get a date. People have been whispering a date for a long time now." And then, of course, he's talking about 2027 there. "I know where that lie comes from. I know specifically what document from the 70s initiated the idea of that lie. A classified document. That is the lie you will be told. You're going to be told that there is a craft on its way to Earth. That's the lie," unquote. And of course, there he's talking about 2027 being the time frame in which this craft either arrives at Earth or we're told it's going to be arriving at Earth. And he's saying that that's part of a lie, setting us up in a kind of a fear state so that some sort of mass grab for power can happen, perhaps even a new world order, a one world government kind of thing. So lots to get into here, but first want to turn it over to you for some of your reflections on what he was saying about this truth setting up a lie and the nature of that lie.
Yeah, this is a difficult one, I think, because it's as you said, it's been part of the conversation for years now that many folks have alluded to. There might be some activity happening 2026, 2027. Yeah, the years are a little fuzzy. They sometimes become 2025, right? I've heard that recently as well. We're going to start hearing things this year. So that the concept has been floated around the community for quite a while. So I think that the new component of it is this discussion point that has arisen from this revelation from Jeremy, and that it's been a purposefully told lie that 2027 is the year that this craft arrives, and that is not really the truth, and that message is being sprinkled throughout the UFO community in various different limited hangouts, and so people think like, oh yeah, this must be true. And so that then raises a whole host of questions on the trustworthiness of the individuals that are presenting that information, right? So we don't know that answer directly from Jeremy. Who's the person that is disseminating this idea that this year? Are they a public person that we all are familiar with? Who would that be? And then if he's saying it's a lie, then that then casts doubt and shadow on all of their other statements. What else are they saying that isn't true? I think that's really the bombshell that I'm seeing kind of being, dealt with today in social media, is that people are trying to wrestle with really the truthfulness of these claims. And on that point, what I want to say, I think this applies to, quite frankly, a lot of things, not just this particular soundbite, but in a topic where a meal is very, very scarce, breadcrumbs can be consumed as if they are nutritious and are a meal. And that's sort of the problem I see in ufology generally. And as anything that happens that has the slightest hint of being something that could be, revelatory, bombastic, exciting, and all of the attention, all of the energy gets absorbed directly into that claim, and then we kind of spin ourselves into a frenzy over the following week, 2 weeks, whatever it is, all trying to make heads or tails of what that means. And, I can point to lots of examples like this. I mean, think about the Las Vegas aliens or the Miami aliens at the mall, even the drones that we've spent time discussing. These are topics that I think are worth our analysis and worth our discussion. But the community, in a way, is sort of like, a cat chasing a laser pointer here. It's just like, when you're operating in that low information zone, we are attracted to anything that looks like something of substance. And I don't know necessarily if this has any particular substance and if it's worth us getting wrapped up into a frenzy about. I think we can agree that the sort of refrain in experiencer circles, the refrain in conversations prior to this announcement for the last several years has been that some sort of event is coming, and it's coming in the next few years. That tends to be the general consensus. But I've yet to find very many people who are really active in the day-to-day conversation who are saying definitively that that's going to be a thing. There's a lot of anticipatory expectation there, but I don't think you see a lot of folks that are really doubling down on a specific year. Other than what I would like to point out here, and we haven't talked about it yet, is Chris Bledsoe, who's been saying something like this for quite some time. That then makes me question, Chris's claims or how he was told or how he felt or interpreted, that information. So you can see where even just me kind of chasing this thread, Darren, like it's easy for us to get lost. And I think in the hall of mirrors here and not know what is up and what is down, what is left, what is right. And that might be in fact, the intent of the information itself is just to sort of distort the picture to some degree. So it requires a lot of discernment, a lot of care, a lot of, I think, patience, things that are often very short supply in the UFO community.
Yeah, absolutely. And a few thoughts here. So First of all, when it comes to this 2027 thing, there's numerous nuances I would want to introduce here. Number one, even Luis Elizondo has kind of hinted at knowing about some sort of date and some sort of major thing happening in the future, but then he says he can't really talk about it, or he's not the one to talk about it. Of course, that just makes people talk about it more because they start wondering about that. And this is something I really want to highlight here, first of all, is for people to be aware of their energy when they hear these kinds of claims. Because as I talked about in my expanding awareness class, when you respond in fear, especially if it's a quite shocking fear that can almost create a kind of traumatic response in us, we kind of freeze. We go into this frozen configuration, and we are not at all response able as a result. We're reactive, actually. And that can also be entirely purposeful. It kind of disempowers us. It puts a lid on our curiosity and tends to make us cower. So you have to be aware not just of whether or not the message is benevolent or malevolent, positive or negative, good, bad, but also what might be the agenda in giving you one of those either way. One message might want to butter you up so you don't know what's coming, and then they can sort of take advantage of you when it finally happens. But on the flip side, a negative or a fearful message might also be delivered so that you cower in fear, you become disempowered, and perhaps so you sign off potentially on broad sweeping new government control. So we think back to 9/11 and the Patriot Act. Many people after the fact said, wow, in retrospect, we really signed off on a lot of our rights, gave them away because of fear, and we wanted Big Brother, in that sense, the American government, to protect us from this terrorist threat. But what did we trade off in exchange for that? So we need to be in real time as much as we can, cognizant of the nature of the message, whether it's a fearful one or a positive one, a hopeful one, and what that does to us. And I would say the opportunity is for us to be growing in our awareness of how we respond and how that either makes us have more agency or less. Something to be aware of there as well.
One more thing to that, because I just wanted to make sure we touched on this. It's an interesting conversation topic as well, because it in a sense kind of whitewashes all of the historical record about the UFO presence, that appears to already be here. And Jeremy does mention this in that little clip. He's like, they're already here, but the lie is that they're coming. Well, I find that lie to be not very convincing. If we weigh that against all of the body of evidence that we already have, that we've heard over the many decades. And so, how I think we need to evaluate, how effective is that lie actually going to be for people that are really going to try to, even those who might take it seriously. Okay, I'm going to take it seriously. Well, what about all this other stuff? I got to reckon with that. I got to make sense of that. You're saying all of that was just a psyop or whatever for the last 80 years. Like it doesn't add up. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, very true. And speaking of that and the body of data and the history and the historical lore, what we often find here as well, if you pay close attention, I would encourage people to do so, is to ask yourself the question, what bodies of data are these various people incorporating into their understanding? So I would ask the question, how much is Jeremy Corbell really considering experience for testimony, experience for lore, when he says, for instance, in this interview, he basically said, the evidence points in this direction, all the evidence, or something like that. Like it was a very bold claim, a very comprehensive claim, absolute in its nature. But my question is he paying attention to experience for lore and experience for testimony? My guess is not, because again, as some experiencers pointed out after they heard Jeremy give this kind of warning, many experiencers perceive there being craft in the sky around 2027. And that's clearly not coming from some sort of government disinformation campaign. That's coming from their ability to perhaps precognitively see what's going to arise. So to say this is only coming from the government and it's all part of a false flag, I think is going too far. So we need to consider these things. Now, of course, we have John Ramirez has been one of the chief people who said that 2027 is a known year. Something's happening. He did say something about them showing up. Now, you could ask the question, because we know John Ramirez is ex-CIA. The question becomes, is John Ramirez a knowing disinformation agent? Or was he perhaps fed disinformation even years ago in preparation for this? This is when it begins to perhaps stretch credulity, because even Jeremy's here saying that this plan has been in place since the 1970s, basically. That would be pretty far-reaching if that was the case, and the scope would be pretty impressive. I don't know that we have many examples like that in history. But all this to say, I think for those who want to now say, okay, so 2027 is a bad thing, how are we going to prepare for that? I think that's premature to say that, and we just don't know. And like you said, they're already here. So this notion that they're slowly getting here seems to stretch our understanding of how they operate. On top of that, too, there's also the question of what they say they are coming back for. So part of what's been introduced into the conversation is that they're coming back for the craft that we shot down, and they're coming back for their kin that we have locked away somewhere, which, of course, without saying it, kind of implies a fearful kind of state, because it sounds like they are ticked off and they're going to come here and in their shock and awe kind of firepower are going to really take it to us because of what we've done, which again puts people into a fear state. So something to be aware of.
Yeah, I want to be careful with what I say, or I try to be careful with what I say, but the perception of imminence often leads to acceleration, right? So I wanted people to think about that. So if the public message is that something is happening soon, and that something is something that we're not necessarily prepared for, that could confront us from a fear state or even an excitement state, well, that has an accelerating effect on human behavior. It's going to accelerate our investment in energy, resources, whatever it may be, to try to prepare for that arrival, right? That imminent arrival. We're gonna move. We're gonna mobilize things in order to try to meet that, whatever it is, so that we're not caught flat-footed. So I would just throw this out there as a pure speculation. What if the use of some of these milestone dates, its underlying psychological aim is to accelerate this conversation in the public space, is to make it so that we are more likely to discuss this, to be energetically invested in it, regardless of whether that actually comes. It has the effect of disseminating this conversation on a much wider basis than it would be if we just had no conception of when this would happen, if it would ever happen at all, right? So this has an accelerating effect to give us this kind of a date and then kind of seed in our minds this conception of arrival.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely important for us to think about the psychological impact of the release of these kinds of dates. Another one I would point to, in addition to what you're saying, is that by saying it's 2027, that also allows fear to fester, right? It's sort of like something you've got put in the fridge and it's kind of slowly rotting. And then when you don't address it over time, it rots more and more, and there's more decomposition. So this could actually allow for fear to ramp up, and people begin to, again, not being very cognizant of their own internal energy, might beget fear from fear from fear, and eventually say, fine, I'm going to sign off. I'm going to let you do whatever you need to do to protect us, because I've been thinking about this for a year. I've been going in circles, and I'm more fearful than ever. So first of all, be aware of your own energy. And number two, ask the question, like you just raised, Nathan, what kind of psychological impact might be behind the announcement of these kinds of dates? And think about that as well. And don't buy into them one way or another. Now, what we talked about a minute ago here that ties in here is this concern, this fear around, this expectation around this move to what might be called the New World Order. And this is an expression that's been bandied about for about 100 years now, maybe longer, where people are concerned that eventually there will be kind of a consolidation effort where we will fall under the influence and the rule of a one world government. And the reason why this is so fascinating, and there's numerous elements to get into here, and I want to get your take too, is because this completely dovetails with religious history. Because I'm very aware, in the Christian circles I used to be in, that there was this sense that we need to watch out, that the government was going to become more and more expansive, even globalization, fears around that as well, because the sense was this is all a power grab, and that what they'll give you is something that seems good on the surface, but it's actually a ruse to set up this one world government, which will ultimately be ruled by this antichrist figure that would emerge. And for those who are not familiar with religious history and kind of religious ways of painting this, it's important to point out that when people in these circles, including some of the right-wing and libertarian circles that are now talking about this, even people like Peter Thiel, for instance, the Antichrist figure is not described as this devil with horns and red and stinking like sulfur that everybody from a mile away knows they're bad news. No, it's someone who's attractive, who's charismatic, who speaks very well, who seems to care about you, and offers you options that make your life seem, at least on a superficial level, better. But the trick is that in that process, you will be robbed of your soul. You will slowly but surely be moved away from an understanding of your spiritual core, and you'll only be concerned about the surface. And in the long run, that basically robs you of your soul. So this is what people are actually concerned about. We have even people like Stephen Greer, of course, saying that be wary of the false flag event. They're going to suggest this is all in preparation for an alien invasion. Please give us more money, give us more power so we can protect you from this. So we have this arising in religious circles. We have this arising in the kind of libertarian and right-wing circles. Even people who are kind of consciousness-centric, but in those circles, are concerned about this transhumanist move on the left from the way that they see it. And as Peter Thiel said, what's worse than apocalypse? It might be this kind of one world government and kind of transhumanist future. So this kind of notion of all of this leading towards the potential ramp up into a new world order, a one world government that ultimately robs people of their spiritual core is a theme that runs across history in these different domains, in these different circles. Fascinating to look at with your perspective, both as a ufologist and as a person steeped in religious history. How do you make sense of that? How do you engage with all of that?
Yeah, I would situate this from the standpoint of the marginalized community, because marginalized communities are often the ones that are most fearful of this notion. So if you think about that for a second, if you're in that minority of the population that maybe doesn't feel like you are treated equally in society generally, that you feel like your rights are being infringed upon in some way or another, or they potentially could be very easily. These are the narratives that have a lot of weight for you, because you feel them very real possibilities. And so historically, when you look at Christian communities, for example, that feared the apocalypse and this one world kind of an empire, what you hear about in historical critical evaluations of those texts, like the Book of Revelation, you hear that that's sort of this Roman Empire conception that Rome is going to sort of crush the Christian movement under its heel, and the Christian movement being very much a fledgling, scrappy, hodgepodge collection of small sort of house churches here and there throughout the Mediterranean. And so they're very concerned about that possibility that they could be kind of infringed upon, wiped out, be the end of their ability to worship freely in the way that they want to. And so you kind of fast forward now, and so it's interesting to me. What I find very fascinating about it is that you have sympathies on the left and the right that have this fear, and so that tells me that there interestingly enough is more of a broader consensus of this concern than there maybe has been historically. Like historically, the concern was housed more so in a smaller, marginalized population. And now we're seeing the concern reside in a broader swath of the population, represented by two different halves of the political spectrum. Well, that's kind of odd. And what that to me speaks to is that there's more so the marginalized, or the feeling of marginalization is being felt or distributed more so across maybe perhaps the majority, and the minority in this case, that is to be the minority to be feared, is what we would say would be like the oligarchical trend that we're seeing in the world today. The elites, right? The elites having all this power and not having the best interests of the people in their hearts. So it's a very, very fascinating sort of resurgence of this concept. Of course, it's been bantied around in the U.S. political circles for quite some time, over the last several decades. And you and I have both talked about that. We even thought in the late '90s there was really momentum moving more so in this direction, this greater globalist direction, interconnectedness across different democracies at least, and free markets, and how that actually hasn't panned out like we thought it might have panned out, given the momentum that it seemed to be gaining before 9/11. And then once 9/11 came along, that seemingly has reversed. But the fears are still there, particularly with the rise of AI, the rise of, the mega billionaires. We're probably going to see a trillionaire at some point in our lifetime. It seems like we're pretty close to that. And so, how does that consolidation of power, how does that affect, really society in general? And what are we going to be willing to give up in exchange for that type of broad control? And, I think, you can see the world that we have now where chaos is sort of the norm. And I don't necessarily mean societally necessarily, but psychologically, there's a lot of chaos. People, I think, are really struggling with putting together a coherent narrative of the world, of their life. And so if someone can come along and say, hey, we're offering you cohesion and competency and protection, well, that's very attractive. But, keep in mind the very people that are offering you that are the people that basically have sold you the chaos. So it's just really, really interesting. And of course, would set things up for, as you alluded to here, this kind of alien threat, or, how we respond to that. How else could we respond if we didn't pool all our resources to try to combat that? So very, very fascinating, in my opinion.
Yeah, there's numerous pieces to get here. And I would want to encourage people to take sort of a multidimensional perspective. We often talk about multidimensionality in terms of ufology and in terms of our nature, but also to think about these kinds of matters also in a multidimensional frame. Let's cover some of the things you brought up. So for instance, yes, absolutely, for the marginalized, for the disenfranchised, there's a sense that the other, the proverbial they, are doing something to us, and we need to be wary of it. And the less you feel represented by those in power, the more you're going to assume that those others, that nefarious they, are actually working in cahoots with evil forces. That's just part of human history, part of our psychological bias. But when we think about something like COVID, we already talked about 9/11 and how we ramped up power with the military. We had the eroding of individual rights of Americans. We had this vast surveillance state that was imposed upon us after 9/11, which we agreed to some degree, and then later found out it was totally operating without any kind of parameters or any kind of adherence to constitutional law, even in some cases. But then we think about what happened with COVID. As you pointed to, we have this ramping up of a few people, an elite with more power, more money. So while some people might come out of COVID and say, it was kind of nice for a while there, the government actually paid me some money because my job wasn't operating because we had to shut down society. But what people often don't notice in retrospect is how the wealthy became so much wealthier during that time and how the powerful, they became all that more powerful. Especially when we have a disruption in our goods and services, we were like, whatever it takes to get things up and running, just make it happen. And in that process, you get this consolidation of power and wealth, which inevitably makes some people, not just conspiracy theorists, but even just, clear-thinking people, ask the question, could that have all been a ruse? Could that all have been part of an operation to let this happen so we're distracted and looking in one direction, while in the meantime, this consolidation of power happens again, which could again lead towards this kind of one world government. Now, for people that are more progressive, people on the left, they would say, listen, climate doesn't adhere to borders. We live on a planet that has interconnected resources. It's all one entity where these different systems flow across the planet. We need to move towards a civilization that adheres to those kinds of principles because that's the way nature actually works. This idea of borders and nation states kind of flies in the face of that. But again, for people that are libertarian and on the right, that screams of one world government, new world order. So this partly explains why we've got people on the left saying we need to move in this direction, and you've got people on the right saying that is all a setup. Don't buy into it. Now, I already talked about how it's so fascinating how we have these parallel kind of narratives, both within ufology as well as in religious history. So you'll be very familiar that Jesus would talk about being in the world, but not of the world. What he meant by that was, yes, we are here. This is where we're located, but we don't want to give in to the principalities and powers that rule this land. And we should be vigilant and always on the lookout for those things that are trying to dupe us. So again, this is very much within those kind of circles that they're looking for these things. They're expecting these kinds of things. But the thing is, it's not just religious people who are being told basically this world is being controlled by negative forces. by the powers of darkness, and therefore you need to be constantly vigilant to not give into it, because they will constantly try to confuse you, manipulate you, again, ultimately to rob you of your soul. But then we've got movements within ufology and experiencer lore and channeling lore, for instance, the raw contact material, which I've talked about. In that narrative, we have this sense that there are beings that volunteer to come back into this frame, incarnate into a human body, called wanderers, who are here to help with the awakening process, basically. When we go from 3D to 4D or 5D, depending on how you look at it. But part of the concern there is that the density in this frame is so intense that people can forget who they truly are in that multidimensional sense, and they get weighed down and they start believing the physicalist lie. They start believing that this is all there is, and they forget who they are. They never wake up, and they actually regress in terms of their consciousness between lifetimes and between incarnations. So this is fascinating to me, how this shows up in these different traditions. And while some people might want to say, well, that's just silly people who don't know any better, I would say when we see that much evidence of the same kind of narrative showing up over and over again, ask yourself what that is. Why is that? Could there be some kernel to truth behind that as well? Because something else I wanted to touch on, in a recent interview, I remember Diana Pasulka talking about when it comes to apocalypses, we've actually had numerous apocalypses through time, and you kind of hinted at it as well. So some Christians saw what happened in their time as the apocalypse, whereas Protestants, especially evangelicals, more recently would say that, no, the apocalypse is still to come. This is the end times. This is the rise of the Antichrist. This is what we need to be on the lookout for. But this is the point, is that people tend to view their own time period, their own era, as the one where it's all going down. In fact, so much so that you and I kind of have become allergic to that notion in our own time because we see it throughout religious history. And yet we can't deny when we look around that we're in a crazy time right now, and things seem to be converging and spiraling towards some sort of climatic moment. Now, one additional piece I want to add here before we move on is that in that multidimensional kind of lens, you can kind of have like almost fractal eclipsing of apocalyptic understanding. What I mean by that is that it's not that earlier interpretations of a kind of apocalypse happening were wrong or right, but that is the first element of that apocalypse, which then later on is eclipsed by an even more overarching apocalypse that sort of stretches across time and space. So I remember when I interviewed this one religious studies professor, and he was saying his perspective is, yes, to some degree, those earlier events, the fall of this or the fall of that, was a kind of apocalypse, but that doesn't deny the fact that there will be an apocalypse at the end of time, which kind of eclipses that. So we want to think about this in a really expansive way. And again, I would just encourage people to think about, not just buy into it fully, nor reject it fully. Ask yourself, why is this narrative so consistent? What might be arising energetically in our midst that gives fuel to that? Pretty fascinating. All right. And now we're going to get into the next one, because there's yet another whistleblower. This is the big one, you might say. And this is coming up tomorrow. We're recording this on a Friday. We'll probably release this around noon tomorrow, so it'll be released ahead of this. But tomorrow night, Saturday night, Ross Coulthart is going to air an interview with Jake Barber, who is someone who's a first-hand witness. So one of the things people have been frustrated by is we hear a lot of people like David Grush, although since then it's come out that he might be a first-hand witness, but the initial concerns were he's hearing stories, anecdotes from other people, and maybe being duped in the process. People want to see the evidence, and they want to hear from first-hand witnesses. Well, now it's happening, and this is kind of what was being teased by Ross Coulthart at the end of last year. We now have a moment where he's going to air an interview with a first-hand witness, a helicopter pilot who saw an egg-like craft, was convinced right away that it was definitely an off-world vehicle, not human origin vehicle. That's coming up tomorrow. What do you think about not just that happening, but what this means in terms of a bookmark in the history of ufology?
Yeah, it's exciting. I mean, it's to put it short, it's very exciting. I think if you've been in this game long enough, though, you sort of go into this with trying to set the bar low. Even so, you're always going like, well, it seems exciting, but I'm prepared for disappointment. I'm prepared to be let down, because that kind of has been the cycle, like Lucy pulling the football out. You know, it's like you feel like you're going to be able to kick it, and it's not there. So yes, he does claim to be a first-hand witness within 150 feet, I believe he says, of this egg-shaped craft. He had eyes on the craft. He was a helicopter pilot, a very credentialed individual, claiming to be part of a special crash retrieval team, in fact, that was sent to retrieve this object. He doesn't seem to have claimed to have touched the craft or been inside the craft or anything of that nature, but we have been teased that the video of this craft is going to be shared as well. Now, we all have experience with video and how shaky that can often be in terms of the quality of that evidence. So that'll be interesting. But then we've also heard that there might be 3 additional individuals who will corroborate Jake Barber's testimony. So again, we just continue to sort of stack the deck here with evidence, with claims of testimony, anecdotes that seem to indicate that there is, in fact, a crash retrieval program, and that program is established to get craft of non-human origin or non-human intelligence. So we'll see. It's one additional, I think, domino in the chain that needs to fall. I think that, as I've always said, that this process is has kind of an exponential curve to it, that it appears really slow for a long time. The momentum feels very, very gradual, almost imperceptibly different from one move to the next. But what we can't see is that larger movement, and that sort of L-shaped curve that we're approaching could be very, very close, where we go into that exponential growth, and all of a sudden we've got more bombastic claim after more bombastic claim after more bombastic claim, until it's just the common, everybody understands that this in fact just is real. And how close are we to that point? I don't know. It's hard to say, but it certainly feels like we're closer than we may have been for quite some time. So, it's very exciting. I'm interested to evaluate these claims and evaluate them in the context of additional evidence, hopefully. And, I think it's challenging. I always try to put myself in the shoes of somebody like Ross Coulthard or Jeremy Corbell, who is sitting on this kind of information and understanding what the social reaction will be to bringing someone forward like this. And so, Ross has been at this long enough, Jeremy's been at this long enough where, in your mind, you're thinking, this is really good. This is going to be the one that's finally going to push that conversation. I mean, how about David Grush, right? Great example of this. If I were Ross Coulthard and I were thinking about David Grush before David went public, I would be thinking, this is what breaks the dam. This is very, very convincing, credible, exactly what we've been waiting for. And look what happened. It didn't get very far, even though it went through to Congress and hearings and sworn in testimony and all that kind of stuff. Did it actually cause the dam to break? I mean, not immediately, but maybe David Grush was sort of that nail in the dam that kind of created a crack, and that crack is finally starting to, fissure out to where the dam can't hold back the information any longer. So, it's a difficult place to be in when you're kind of the caretaker of these individuals and their stories. But I'm hoping that, eventually one day will come where that witness will be the witness. And what's funny is, at least in my own experience, the one that finally breaks the dam is probably not the one that really was the most bombastic. It's just like, well, yep, now we're finally there. The claim that they're making is something we've heard all along, and people have been saying it for years. But the fact that it came from, whoever it came from Barack Obama or President Trump or, whoever it is, if it came from that person, well, then now I can believe it. Now I've been given the societal permission to say that this is in fact real. So very, very interesting. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I think about the analogy of sometimes, speaking of climate change, we see a lot of these situations where rivers are growing ever wider and wider, and we see these buildings on the side that we see erosion happening, and eventually we see the momentous moment where the building collapses into the water. We're kind of seeing that with ufology right now. It seems like the water's running faster, there's more volume, it seems like the breadth of the river is wider, and it looks like we're seeing soil erode away, and we're just waiting for that moment when finally the building collapses into the water, which in this case would be widespread acceptance of this, widespread engagement from mainstream media, that kind of thing. A few things to say about this particular situation. I think your warning there is well issued in the sense that, yes, we can tend to get hyped about these things and they tend to underdeliver. So it's always better to go in with low expectation and, if anything, be impressed rather than being disappointed. I think back to, you may remember when Ryan Bledsoe was teasing that there was going to be this video or image of a non-human intelligence and it was going to change everything. And then when it came out, it was blurry, hard to see, and certainly not something that people felt was very compelling. And many people felt almost like it was a deliberate deception because it was so underwhelming in terms of the delivery in the end. Again, I think that just comes down to, I don't think in that sense Ryan was being disingenuous. I think he thought it was going to shift things, but people, especially people who are not even convinced there's a there yet, didn't find that evidence compelling at all. So we're still seeing that happen here as well. Now, it's interesting because the craft is being described as egg-shaped. Now, of course, this is part of the lore. This kind of shape has shown up over and over again. Lonnie Zamora is someone who witnessed the craft like this. It's very, very common. We again have an expert witness, a helicopter pilot who had many hours flying and also probably came across some pretty top secret things in his time and had a very good sense of what man-made vehicles look like. And, Mick West aside, these people I think we should take seriously because they know when they see something that should not be able to get airborne, right? He talked about there being no heat surfaces, no obvious signs of propulsion, that kind of thing. It's also interesting because, as you pointed to, we're going to have apparently 3 additional military veterans. We're going to go on record and on camera. Joe Khalil of Use Nation announced this to corroborate Jake Barber's account. Now, you and I both know that there's been this slow crescendo building over time because we think about Marco Rubio, who's been on camera. And of course, I want to remind people he's part of the Gang of 8. So that means he is witness to secrets that many people in Congress are not. And he said repeatedly, and not shyly, he said, listen, either there's a vast psychological operation and people with high credentials, with long careers, successful careers, that we trust with our most sensitive secrets are all being duped at the same time, which raises concerns in itself, or there's something here, and there's something to this notion of crash retrievals. So, fascinating time. We also, of course, hear news about it being said that the witness says that members of the UAPTF, which is the UAP task force, which preceded Arrow, confirmed to him that the craft was non-human, which raises interesting questions around what was the nature of that conversation. Was the UAPTF actually saying those kinds of things to witnesses? It seems strange to me, but that's apparently been claimed. And I think in addition to that, speaking of the successor to the UAPTF, I think it has been said of Barber himself and definitely other witnesses that they did go to Arrow. They did give their testimony. At first, they sensed they're being taken seriously, but many of them, if not most of them, maybe all of them, never got a call back, never felt like the information was really taken seriously. And of course, since then, people have bandied about an even more concerning notion that maybe Arrow has been not just a disinformation campaign and part of the historic cover-up, but actually they're trying to flush out these whistleblowers so they can plug the leaks. They can not only discredit the whistleblowers, but try to find out how the leaks happened to begin with so they can plug them up to basically carry on the decades-long, 80-year-long kind of disinformation campaign and cover-up. So any additional thoughts on that and how that plays into the history?
It's going to be very interesting. The credibility of the UAPTF has been, I think, brought into question recently because there's been several different quote-unquote members of the UAPTF who maybe have embellished the role that they played in that organization. And I think the public needs to understand the UAPTF was a conglomerate of efforts. It involved individuals across the intelligence apparatus that oftentimes kind of donated some of their time to the effort in analyzing the content that they would receive. And so they might come out and say, I was part of the UAPTF, but they weren't necessarily part of it in the sense that was their full-time job. They were sort of partly involved with the UAPTF effort. But what I want to know, I think everyone would want to know about this claim is who specifically was on the UAPTF who corroborated that this was non-human intelligent craft. Who was it? Who did it come from? Was this some just sort of analyst that kind of was there for part-time and said, yeah, that looks like non-human to me? Or was it literally somebody that was, running the effort? Was it somebody like Jay Stratton or someone else? Like, who was the individual? And then that is, of course, is going to have its own baggage, right? Because we all know that everybody's got some sort of axe to grind with one of these individuals, and there's been credibility issues cast up upon them, whether or not how trustworthy they are. But that, as you know, and I know, that all kind of depends on your frame of reference. How what I think is credible might be different from someone else's definition of credibility. So will be very interesting. But the volume, again, this is where I think is the most compelling aspect of this, is the volume of testimony that we continue to see pointing in the same direction. I find it very, very, very difficult for all of these individuals to put themselves forward in the public light, and for just to be some mass delusion that they just, happen to believe that this egg-shaped craft wasn't really non-human at all. It was some sort of piece of a fuselage that fell from the air, from a SpaceX launch or something. Like these are people that are not going to confuse these things. This is not going to happen. So it'd be very interesting, as always, what the reaction will be. But I think in the community, it's one of excitement, and then we'll just have to see what kind of legs does it have in the broader conversation.
Yeah, and to your point, I agree with you that I doubt, I am highly suspicious of the notion that whatever footage is shown will be so compelling that it will persuade a huge number of detractors and skeptics. I think that it'll be enough to probably make those who are already on this page think, yeah, there's more evidence there, but probably not clear enough that the Mick West of the world will be convinced. Again, there's an ongoing question about how sincere is Mick West and how intellectually honest is he being. But we at least will have some footage, because, again, that's been one of the major rallying cries, is we need to see the data ourselves. We don't want to just hear stories. We want to see some of the data. That apparently is something we're going to see. Now, again, I would just want to raise there as a quick aside that the government has been very apprehensive to release footage. And the story goes, the thinking is, it's because the second you show any footage, you're potentially showing your adversaries clues about the nature of that propulsion, the nature of the technology. And that's not something you want to do if there's even a chance that they could somehow weaponize something based on something they observe. So that itself makes me question, what kind of footage will this be? We've seen before situations where, for instance, Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp have said they were able to obtain footage because it's someone using their cell phone camera to take a picture of some other screen or something. So it's secondhand and technically, therefore, not the property of the U.S. military. So we'll see how grainy or how clear this image is and how much it moves the ball. Now, speaking of Ross Coulthart, he recently also was on the podcast with Donald Trump's son, and he told him pretty plainly what he thinks the new administration should do regarding disclosure of the historic cover-up. Now, you could make the argument that that's pretty close to Trump's ear. How much will that play in? You also have people like Tim Burchett who think that people like Lou Elizondo should be employed by the new administration to perhaps run some sort of new overarching program. So you made the point that with the UAPTF, and even going back to ATIP and whatnot, sometimes these were people who had other day jobs, and an additional portfolio they took on was this UFO thing. So Lou has made the point that what we need is a single point of entry, a top of the spear, if you will, that we can take all these different agencies and bring together all that information in the same way that the Department of Homeland Security did for the FBI and the CIA and whatnot, so that we have one body that is making sense of all the data. He's saying that wouldn't even necessarily cost more money. It's just a rearrangement of resources. And people like Tim Burchett have recommended that Lou Elizondo could be this new UFO czar to basically run that organization. So we'll see what happens. I know many people are excited, looking forward to the shift in the administration, because they think it will mark a time period where the government becomes much more forthright about UFOs, because it's going to be coming from the top down, the executive branch down. We shall see. History suggests it might be more complicated than that, but in a few weeks' time, we'll begin to see how the new administration is going to handle this particular topic. All right, now something else I wanted to quickly touch on was that many people, again, might say, this is all U.S. focused. Why is this ufology topic only American-centric? That seems ridiculous. But of course, that's not true. It just sometimes gets more of the hype. Because recently, the Office of the Chief Science Advisor of Canada has released a preliminary report titled Management of Public Reporting of the Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon in Canada. This document recommends the creation of a federal research body to manage and analyze UAP sightings more effectively, following the example of similar organizations in the US, France, and Chile. The initiative aims to improve scientific rigor and public reporting on UAPs, focusing on transparency and misinformation mitigation. So we are seeing this happen internationally. And I just want to take a moment here for everyone to pause and just notice how much movement we've had, how much traction this is gaining. Everybody wants this watershed moment to happen, but I think it's important to take a moment and realize for someone who is into this topic in the 60s or the 50s or the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, this is a remarkable time. We're seeing so much movement. Now, in terms of movement, I want to get your take on this because what's also happened recently is that Mike Turner has been removed as chair of the House Intel Committee. And of course, he was rumored to be one of the roadblocks for the passing of the UAP Disclosure Act. So maybe that creates another opening for movement here. So what's your take on all of that?
Yeah, that's very interesting, right? I mean, Mike Turner rumored to have been the one kind of standing in the way of progress in Congress on this topic, and that, you know, the conjecture was that he was in the kind of in the pocket of aerospace companies, defense contractors, and they persuaded him through donations, et cetera, to not take this more seriously and kind of put the damper on the movement. You know, it's more complicated than that, like it always is. I think people underestimate the relative intractability of consensus reality, consensus decision making, and perception on this topic just broadly. That politicians, they always have to do some political calculus on, is championing this cause, is backing the UAP caucus going to be good for my political image, particularly, you know, from the district that I represent. You know, perhaps the answer to that is no, whether or not they think those claims are credible or not. It's a cold, hard political calculus that this just doesn't make sense for me to spend the political capital that I have in backing this effort. So, you know, I'm one that I think, you know, and everybody knows who listens to this show, I try to be a little more even-handed and not jump on the, you know, hate train for certain individuals. I don't know Mike Turner. I don't have a lot of, you know, in-depth knowledge of his political history, you know, his party affiliation. I'm aware of that, but, you know, I don't have enough knowledge to definitively say, you know, Mike Turner was the problem. You know, I know that that's the consensus among a lot of the talking heads, that Mike Turner was the problem. But, you know, as far as where I could say that definitively myself, I just can't. And so I don't know. The proof will be in the pudding, right? So the rumor is that Representative Crawford is going to be taking that helm as part of the House Intelligence Committee going forward. And he asked some very interesting questions at the last hearing where he was present. And so that, you know, could bode well for the momentum here. But in terms of whether this next administration will be more, you know, pro UAP or not, that remains to be seen. There's certainly a lot of individuals in the Trump circle who seem to take this very, very seriously and also seem to have Trump's ear. So his son, obviously, but, you know, I think others like Tucker Carlson and Tim Burchett and many others, Representative Luna. I mean, there are many that are closer to Trump and his inner circle who I think would be able to influence this direction. But Trump himself has publicly said, you know, yeah, he's been told a lot of this stuff, but and he doesn't necessarily believe it, you know. So that's interesting. Will Trump spend any energy, effort into moving this forward or not? I don't know. I think it's difficult to say that the Trump administration, like any administration, will operate as a monolith. I think there are going to be some movements and activities that come out of that administration that aren't necessarily orthodox in the way we've seen political change occur. We're going to see some things that happen that aren't happening by the traditional playbook. And so that means we have more opportunity for, in a sort of unscripted moments where things just kind of happen. Like, oh, you know, we gave Kash Patel the reign over the FBI, and all of a sudden he's just dumping their file folders out into the street. You know, I didn't know he was really going to do that, but now he's doing it. And look what I found in those documents. I mean, it's going to be stuff kind of like that I think we're going to find, and who knows what will be in those types of you know, oops, revelatory kinds of moments, peeks behind the curtain. We'll have to see.
It will be interesting. And like you say, the question is, will there be a draining of the swamp, or will there just be a reordering of the swamp players? Of course, another question that arises is, regardless of to what extent this deep state actually exists, and different people define that differently, but we're talking about almost like a different kind of government beyond legislation, beyond oversight from democratically elected members of Congress and whatnot, might exist in the deep trenches of the government, might even be kind of rogue at this point. The question is, if there is a push from the top to really uncover some of that stuff and get rid of it, what will the pushback look like? Those groups are considerable in terms of their power, pretty formidable opponents to take on. So what will happen? We shall see. Be very interesting. Now, I want to touch on something you said there, because when you made the point that, you don't know exactly what stopped the UAP Disclosure Act from passing in the way that it was originally drafted, I want to highlight that, because what I've actually heard, even in a conversation I had with Kirk McConnell a couple months ago, was that from his point of view, a major part of the problem is still convincing enough Congress people that there's even a there there. So it's not just these sort of nefarious figures that we kind of want to point our fingers at, that we're still in this situation where, like you said, different Congress people are going to be doing personal calculus. Will this help me? Will this potentially embarrass me? And if there's a chance for potential embarrassment, they might just not sign off on it, not because they don't think it's potentially true, but just because it doesn't necessarily help them. So this ongoing calculus and still trying to persuade Congress people and members of government that this is real, along with the mainstream media, is still an ongoing affair for sure. Now, we touched on before, this is kind of the final piece we can get into in terms of whistleblowers. We touched on the many different documentaries that are out right now. Of course, one of those is James Fox's The Program, which is all about the reverse engineering programs and people who have been involved in that. Great documentary. We highly recommend people check it out. Definitely helping to move us towards disclosure. Now, of course, one of the key whistleblowers in that documentary is Jason Sands. Now, people may remember, we talked about this, I think, in an earlier podcast. This was kind of notorious because Jason Sands actually jumped the gun, some might say, and showed up in a Twitter or X space before the release of the movie and started making some pretty bold claims. And some people I know, even on the inside, who again are trying to always do that calculus. How can we get more and more people that are skeptical to believe this so we can get traction towards disclosure? We're kind of concerned about how that happened, because they'd rather keep the more outlandish, the more paradigm-stretching elements out of the game for now, out of the conversation, just talk about craft for now, so that we can get traction and then later on introduce that piece. Because the concern of those people on the inside that I know is that if we give too much of the detail, even if it's real, it will actually make some people disengage from the process, and we won't get movement towards disclosure like we could have otherwise. Now, since then, of course, while initially Jason Sands talked about meeting an alien, meeting a being, and having a very helpful encounter with this being, they came away with a very positive take on the nature of this being. He also more recently, in an interview, talked about being part of some nefarious program that seemed to be overlapped between some elements of the rogue U.S. military and perhaps some less than benevolent NHI groups, and that he talked about being woken up in the middle of the night, taken to a certain place, being given a weapon, told to go into a cave in which he would encounter an NHI of one sort or another, and then he was supposed to kill that NHI, and then go back to bed as if nothing had happened, and if he were to talk about it, it would be a threat to his life, his family, etc. So, we've been talking about bodies of data, what people take seriously, when is it a bridge too far? For many people, it's interesting to watch people's instinctual reaction to say, there's no way that's possible. So now I question Jason Sands' testimony altogether. It also makes me question James Fox's credibility, because shouldn't he have vetted this person more? But of course, what's interesting about that is that people are assuming it's not true. So what's your take on not just what he said, but the reaction within ufology afterwards?
I think conventionally, Jason Sands has hurt James Fox's credibility. I think from that conventional viewpoint that Fox should have sort of screened out this testimony, not included him in the documentary because of this claim. And I say that because the conventional possibility space is incredibly narrow. What is okay to discuss as possible within the realm of ufology? We can talk about this over here and this over there. Everything has to be within the bounds of those bookmarks, right? the bookends. And I think when you're delving into, clandestine alien assassination squads, I think as of right now, most people, perhaps rightly so, that's not in the possibility space. That is far outside the bookend of what is acceptable as credible testimony. And I think, that's a rational position to have, because what acceptable evidence is there to say that that is behavior that has actually taken place? I say that at the same time, we have plenty of individuals who have alluded to the fact that this has in fact taken place, that the activities along this type have taken place. Grush has talked about agreements between entities in the U.S. government or elements of the U.S. government or agencies. Grush has talked about, people who've been harmed, malevolent intent on behalf of these certain entities. So, you put those puzzle pieces onto the table, and it's not hard to go from those puzzle pieces to a picture where, does this kind of activity take place? Yeah, I think it certainly could take place. That then becomes part of the possibility space. But, the main point I would say here is that I think all of us, we always have to be willing to challenge our prior assumptions, be ready to challenge our priors, because we go into this conversation thinking, I'm willing to digest, to metabolize, information if it's like this. And if you're starting to tell me that, last night you channeled a being that had the head of an eagle, and he told you this, that, or the other, then that I started having difficulty digesting that, right? That's just not something that I'm willing to say is okay. But other people would say, well, I've actually had a similar experience like that. I've had an entity that appeared to me that looked just like that. And it was the most real experience I've ever had. And therefore, I find you more credible than people that haven't had that experience and are talking about something else. So you can see how the context here, the background of the individual, it makes a lot of difference in terms of whether or not that is within the realm of what is possible. I think it's good overall that this is part of the conversation. I think it did create a friction point for the program in terms of its overall impact. I think that's safe to say, but I also think it's positive in the sense that it has catalyzed and prompted conversations like this, where we can try to publicly discuss, where does this type of information fall in the broader conversation? And I think we're just so eager, and we have to really resist this temptation. We're so eager to look for people to say, yeah, that's okay. Like, yeah, I think that's possible. That's totally real. If Lou Elizondo says that happened, then okay, now Jason Sands is totally fine. We're really eager to look for people to kind of give us that confirmation to say it's acceptable to think that this is what happened. And I think instead of looking for that, we just need to say, look, okay, this is a claim. I'm evaluating this claim. I'm going to kind of, if I'm not ready myself to commit to it, I'm going to put it on the shelf. I'm not going to throw it in the bin. I'm going to put it on the shelf, and maybe I'm going to come back to that if we get more information. And then at that point, we'll say, hey, Jason Sands, you were right. And I really do believe you. Or, hey, Jason Sands, like, I'm sorry, but that's just a bridge too far.
Yeah, and it's important to distinguish the difference between whether or not the claims are truthful and whether or not the claims will help the cause. Now, I do want to point out something here, though, because I am aware, again, of people on the inside who are constantly making that calculus and only wanting to present the information from the whistleblowers, from the witnesses that they find the most credible, that they know will have the most traction in Congress, for instance. And that's because they know this is already an outside-the-box kind of notion, this entire matter. And so they think that any detraction from credibility will undermine the whole process here. But something I want to introduce here is that a conservative mind that kind of, I think, is in opposition to that to some degree, or maybe transcends that, is I don't want us to miss the possibility here, the real possibility for transformation of our understanding of not just who they are and what this is, but who we are, and how a more transcendent understanding of the entire possibility space could deliver unto us a new future that could fundamentally change some of the concerns we have about the nature of our civilization. In other words, when we try to truncate this, make it fit within the paradigms that already exist, we might miss out the most important parts in terms of the transformational potential. So something about these elements tend to dovetail together, not just religious history and ufology, but psi phenomena. We hear about people like Lil Zondo being involved in remote viewing. Out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences have very similar elements to abduction accounts and contact experiences. How does this all fit together? Like you say, some people might say, I believe that gray aliens are real. So if someone said they had a conversation with a gray, I'll believe that, but not an eagle-headed celestial figure. That doesn't count. That's too far for me. Ask yourself why. Ask yourself what kind of evidence you have to so confidently say that. So this is a reprieve we've often raised on this podcast, which is to turn the lens within, look at yourself, be aware of your own process. And to sort of finish off here, I just want to say that to sort of build on some of what you said, yes, people like David Grush have pointed to accords. I've made this point many times. When you think about the spiral of consciousness development, these different stages that emerge, when different beings move closer and closer to an understanding of non-duality, a connection around oneness, a unit of experience, what kind of beings, at what stage or what level will be the ones making accords with the military-industrial complex? I really want people to think about that and think about an intelligence, a species, a faction that not only has vast technological capability, but also understands how to manipulate consciousness. This is something that's in play here. So as we move forward, I would encourage people to be open-minded. I definitely think there's something to what Jason Sands is saying. I've definitely heard reports from other people I find credible who claim similar things. Of course, this moves into secret space program kind of territory, which again is one of those bridges that for some people is just too far. But when you evaluate this evidence, don't just have this knee-jerk reaction. Look at the evidence and just as much look within, ask yourself how you're examining this evidence, what kind of biases show up to determine how you evaluate different kinds of evidence, and make sure that you're growing in the process. And as I say, going back to this potential consciousness manipulation of different kinds of groups, both different groups within the U.S. military who've been studying this for decades. Think about MK Ultra, some of the stuff that gets used within the secret space program, as well as NHI, who have a deep and broad understanding of consciousness. Make sure that you're working this inward process to be aware of your own energy, so you're more likely to be aware when you're being duped, manipulated, not just in an outward way, but also energetically, because that's going to be essential for the world to come.
Well said. I think we're entering a time where the potential for chaotic energy is very, very high. I'm sensing that just where we are this week. It's a lot of things are happening, taking place, potential for energy there. And so your advice is well taken, and we should really take some time to put that into practice. All right. At the close, may the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits, and we'll see you next time on Liminal Phrames.